Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. In this video series, we're looking at ancient Near Eastern iconography, or images and their symbolism from the world of the ancient Near East, and how it's used and adapted in the biblical text. We'll look at specific passages and how Near Eastern iconography helps us see the passage in a wider context. We'll also look at various motifs used in Near Eastern iconography and how it may be at play in certain places in the biblical text. In today's video, we're going to look at some of the Near Eastern imagery behind Psalm 76. Let's start by reading it together. For the director of music with stringed instruments, a psalm of Asaph, a song. God is renowned in Judah. In Israel, his name is great. His tent is in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shields and the swords, the weapons of war. You are radiant with light, more majestic than mountains rich with game. The valiant lie plundered, they sleep their last sleep. Not one of the warriors can lift his hands. At your rebuke, God of Jacob, both horse and chariot lie still. It is you alone who are to be feared. Who can stand before you when you are angry? From heaven you pronounced judgment, and the land feared and was quiet. When you, God, rose up to judge, to save all the afflicted of the land. Surely your wrath against mankind brings you praise, and the survivors of your wrath are restrained. Make vows to the Lord your God and fulfill them. Let all the neighboring lands bring gifts to the one to be feared. He breaks the spirit of rulers. He is feared by the kings of the earth. This psalm is a theophany, or a self-revelation of God and his glory. Now, while in previous videos we've explored theophanies using storm god imagery and creation imagery, this theophany uses militaristic imagery. Psalm 76 depicts God as a victorious king surveying the aftermath of a battle over his defeated enemies. It demonstrates the power and reputation of God over the military forces of the surrounding nations. God intimidates these earthly powers in his judgment as his victory saves the oppressed from those who would exploit them. This psalm may have a particular setting, commemorating the failed siege of Jerusalem by the Assyrian army in 701 BC. This setting fits with verse 2, which talks about God's dwelling place being established in Salem and Zion, both of which are synonymous with ancient Jerusalem. Verse 3, in which God broke the flashing arrows, the shields and swords, the weapons of war, may describe the defeat of the Assyrians in their attempt to conquer Jerusalem. Finally, we see a clue to this setting in an addition to the superscription of this psalm in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This note adds that this psalm is to be performed according to the Assyrian, presumably the name of the musical arrangement, and one which ties in with these implied connections to the siege of Jerusalem. Now, with this setting in mind, now we're going to look at the Near Eastern imagery and context behind this psalm.
This psalm describes a scene of victory, God victorious over his vanquished foes. This was a favorite way to depict kings in the ancient world. We have lots of these scenes of kings reveling in victory over vanquished enemies, and this imagery is applied to God in this psalm. Such depictions served to show the exploits and victories of ancient kings and served as a type of propaganda. We see this in Assyria, for example, where we have numerous depictions of battles and sieges which were won by various Assyrian kings. While they're ultimately victorious, we sometimes do see depictions of the actual battle. This scene, for example, is a wall panel that would have stood in the palace of the king. It shows a city on a hill that is under siege. We can see here that the battering ram and the ladder is trying to scale the ramparts. And things aren't going well for those in the city, as we can see some of them impaled outside the city walls and others being executed outside the city. So overall, this is really quite a violent scene. We see a similar scene here with the king Ashurnasirpal II shown firing arrows at an enemy city. This wall panel also shows Ashurnasirpal II. Here he is in his chariot, with slain enemies beneath his rearing horses. The enemies shoot back at him as he pursues them, but overhead we see his god Ashur fighting with him, ensuring the victory of the king. In this psalm, however, we do not see the battle itself, but the aftermath. Thankfully, we also have quite a few images like this from the ancient Near East that will help us see the depiction of God that's being evoked. Here we see Assyrian soldiers looting a burnt and destroyed tent camp, with tent poles and the dead strewn about visible in the lower panel. This relief shows Assyrian forces successfully attacking an Egyptian fortress controlled by the pharaoh Taharka. His Nubian soldiers, you can see here, are recognized by the single feather they wear on their foreheads. What does this have to do with Psalm 76, other than the link between this psalm and post-battle victory scenes? In the ancient world, these victorious armies practiced a custom which may be referenced in this psalm. In verse 5, most translations say something like, "Not one of the warriors can lift his hands." This is because the Hebrew phrase can be a bit tricky to translate. One scholar, Joel Lamon, has argued this should be translated, "None of the mighty men are able to find their hands." His argument, which I do find convincing, is that this verse recalls the way a victorious king would count the enemy's dead, by removing various body parts for them to be counted. We can see this here where Assyrian soldiers are in a grove of palm trees, stacking the heads of the dead enemies with the loot they took from the battle. In this particularly grisly scene, the victorious soldiers are preparing to count heads of the dead in order to know how many of their enemies they had killed. While various body parts could be used in this practice, we see hands in particular being counted frequently. We see one example on the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt. This drawing shows the pharaoh Ramses III sitting on the right. In front of him are 3 lines of men, and at the front of each line are men dumping the severed hands of the defeated enemy. We can see a bit more detail in this photograph from elsewhere in the temple. Now this is a custom the Bible claims the ancient Israelites practiced as well. King Saul asked David for the foreskin of 100 Philistines for the dowry of his daughter Michal in 1 Samuel 18. Other than the natural oddity of this request, it isn't an overly odd thing in context. Saul is asking for proof of death for 100 enemy soldiers. Removing dead body parts was how ancient Near Eastern soldiers counted the dead, and in this case, enemy foreskins. Back in Psalm 76, in the following verse, verse 6, the horses of the enemy's chariotry are subdued, and the chariotry was comprised of the nobles, and they were elite soldiers. The chariot was a byword for strength and power, and yet this psalm describes the chariotry being laid low. This may recall a scene like this image from an Assyrian palace, which shows Chaldean captives on the top few panels. On the bottom panel, shown in greater detail here, we see the enemy's horses and several men dead in the river. Finally, this psalm seems to utilize lion imagery, which was commonly associated with kings in the ancient Near East. This is most obvious in verse 2, which can alternatively be translated as, "His den has been in Salem, his lair in Zion." This imagery can inform how we read verse 4 about mountains rich with game, or more literally, mountains of prey. This evokes the image of God hunting Israel's enemies and vanquishing them. This lion imagery also enriches the way we picture Israel's enemies fearing and being unable to stand before God's ferocious wrath, like the wrath of an attacking lion. If we look at this image here, we can see a lion attacking another animal in a mountain. So this imagery was often applied to both kings and gods in the Near East, but as far as we can tell in Judah, they tended to limit lion imagery to God. We're working on a whole video about lion imagery, so be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it.
The most obvious and possibly the most troubling aspect of this psalm is the way it evokes very violent images. The ancient scenes that are imagined here include enemies strewn on the ground, slaughtered, with their bodies being mutilated in order to tally the dead. Violence in the Old Testament is a very broad issue that we don't have time to fully explore here, but I do want to note a few ways that this psalm tempers and contextualizes the violent imagery behind it. First, the battle, or more accurately the aftermath of the battle, depicted here, is not the victory of an earthly king, but of Yahweh. The battle is not fought for the glory of an earthly power of a king, but in service of Yahweh and in order to save the afflicted of the land. It's not a conquest, but rather a defensive battle. Yahweh enters into battle in order to protect his habitation in Zion and his people who dwell there, especially the most vulnerable people, not to conquer new territory. Second, we need to explore an important distinction in ancient Near Eastern art between kinetic violence, that is, portrayals of violence being carried out, and resultative violence, or the aftermath of kinetic violence. Within the iconography of the ancient Near East, kings and deities are shown with resultative violence, but not often with kinetic violence. We see this in the examples from the previous section of this video. The scholar Joel Lamone writes, "The safest way of representing royal power while also preserving the honor and power of the king is to limit the explicit, i.e. kinetic, representations of the king inflicting violence on the body of another." So here Yahweh is reviewing the aftermath of a battle, and we don't see him actually kill anyone, in the same way we don't often see kings of other nations actually kill anyone when their victories are depicted. Citing the philosopher Michel Foucault, Lamone says, "The one who metes out the violence of the state is constantly susceptible of receiving shame rather than honor for his ostensibly just killing." Foucault describes the acts of state-sanctioned violence as chaotic moments, when the public's allegiance and sentiments can shift, rather violently, toward the one suffering punishment and against the executor of punishment. In Psalm 76 presents images of stunned or dead enemies whom somehow God has mastered, but the nature of that mastery is ambiguously left to the imagination. The only kinetic violence is against the enemy's weaponry, horse and chariot, not against human enemies. Thus, Yahweh is spared the shame of being directly associated with the violence that has been enacted on Israel's enemies. So how does this affect our reading of Psalm 76? Well, we can't escape the fact that there is violent imagery associated with and seemingly authorized by Yahweh, but we also shouldn't miss the ways in which this imagery is both distanced from Yahweh and serving a distinctive purpose that is different than the purposes for which earthly kings would enter into battle. God is defending God's people, and the resulting victory is a sign that not only the Assyrians, but all the nations on earth should fear and tremble before God's might. We also need to remember that war and violence were much more immediate realities for ancient peoples than they are for many of us today, particularly those of us in the United States and other Western nations. In the ancient world, if your God couldn't defend you from your enemies, even by violence, then your God was pretty useless. So we see God in Psalm 76 coming to Israel's rescue, defending God's people, and especially the most vulnerable, against an immediate violent threat. How else could God love and care for God's people but to rescue them, defeat their enemies, and serve notice to the surrounding nations that the God of Israel is unconquerable? Finally, let's look at the response that the psalmist calls for in verses 11 and 12. The NASB translation renders these verses, "Make vows to the Lord your God and fulfill them. All who are around him are to bring gifts to him who is to be feared. He will cut off the spirit of princes. He is feared by the kings of the earth." Israel is called to respond to God's victory by making vows to God and fulfilling them. This victory is to be an occasion for renewing their commitment to serving God. Those who stand against God and God's people are to fear him, but those who serve God are to bring gifts to honor him and vows to serve him. As we read this psalm today, we too are called to respond with reverence, adoration, and renewed commitment to serving the God who is revealed in his victorious might. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.